Today we're going to continue our series on the history of Charlemagne by covering the conflict that lasted for most of his reign, the Saxon Wars. The sources used is listed in the description below. I'm following history, and in this video we're going to cover the 33-year-long brutal and bloody war between Francia and Saxony. Stay tuned. The conflict between Saxony and Francia was a struggle that predated the Carolingian dynasty. Long before Charlemagne set his eyes on the region, both his father and grandfather had several times fought against raiding Saxon armies, pillaging northeastern Francia by waging punitive wars, establishing truces with local tribes, and constructing castles along the border. However, in the early years of Charlemagne's reign, this defensive Francian policy towards Saxony would be changed radically. In the early months of 772, a Saxon raiding party invaded northeastern Francia and pillaged several villages close to the border, as well as burning down the local church in the small town of the Venter. When news reached Charlemagne of what had happened, he had just inherited the eastern part of the Frankish kingdom when his brother Charlemagne had passed away due to natural causes the year before. In the south, the pact with the Lombards and the papacy seemed at the moment to be stable, which meant that there were no military threat in either the east or the south, which in turn meant that Charlemagne could focus all of his attention to respond to the Saxon aggression. In spring of 772, he assembled a large force in the city of Worms, and from there marched north into Saxony. Upon arriving, he defeated a large Saxon army and captured the Saxon castle of Eresburg, which he manned with a Frankish garrison. He then did something that none of his predecessors had done before. He marched northwest and destroyed the pagan shrine called the Irminsul. The Irminsul was likely a large tree in the shape of a pillar, thought to hold up the heavens, and was a central shrine in the pagan Saxon religion. Its destruction served to send a clear message. The king of the Franks was not content with waging punitive wars and establishing truces. He was here to conquer. Upon defeating another Saxon force, shortly after the Irminsul's destruction, many of the western Saxon tribes submitted to Francia and exchanged hostages to display their loyalty to their new overlord. However, despite having exchanged hostages, the Saxons' loyalty came to be short-lived. Not long after Charlemagne had left Saxony and turned his attention elsewhere, the tribes abandoned their hostages and rose up in rebellion. Between 773 and 777, several Saxon rebellions were launched, with Francian castles and strongholds being destroyed, and Christian missionaries being persecuted. The most famous of these rebellions were led by the Germanic noble Widukind, who would prove to be an uttermost ardent opponent to the Franks. However, despite fierce fighting and ardent determination, Charlemagne would time and time again gather a new force, march into Saxony, and strike down the uprisings. The Saxon rebels did manage to pull off a couple of victories against the Franks, but when faced by an army led by Charlemagne, they would always be faced with defeat, due to often being outnumbered as well as being less organized. Upon facing a crushing defeat against Charlemagne in 777, Widukind would be forced to flee north to the land of the Danes, where he would stay for several years. During the same year, Charlemagne gathered his vassals at the royal diet in the city of Paderborn. The purpose of the diet was to discuss what laws should be implemented in the conquered Saxon territory, with nearly all of the Saxon nobles except Widukind attending. Having to personally put down Saxon rebellions for years, Charlemagne had lost his patience, which can be seen in his unforgiving stance against any opposition or dissent, especially when it came to religion, declaring it to be a capital crime to observe heathen practices or disturb the king's peace. Many of the Saxon nobles who attended chose to be baptized, and for a few years the diet seemed to have had a positive effect on the stability of the region, with no new rebellions occurring. However, under the surface tensions were still brewing. During the early 1780s, Charlemagne would institute more laws in the region, which were even more severe on religious issues, as well as personally assisting in several mass baptisms. This violent and aggressive way of spreading Christianity arose criticism even among people close to Charlemagne, not least from his closest advisor Alcuin of York, who urged leniency, claiming that the word of God should be spread by missionary work and persuasion, and not by the sword. His advice would come to fall upon deaf ears, and new Saxon rebellions arose in response to the stricter laws. In 782, Widukind returned to Saxony and led a new revolt against the Franks. This revolt was initially a success, with Widukind annihilating a Frankish army at the Battle of Suntel. This battle would be followed with over 2 years of constant warfare between Charlemagne and Widukind. To get back at the rebels for destroying one of his armies, Charlemagne is said to have ordered the beheading of over 4,000 rebels in an event known as the Blood Court of Verdun. The conflict raged on between 782 and 785. The turning point of the conflict came in 785 when, to the surprise of many, Widukind willingly surrendered to Charlemagne, chose to be baptized and swear fealty to the Frankish king on the condition that no bodily harm would befall him. Charlemagne accepted Widukind's surrender, and Widukind would later become a Saxon noble under Charlemagne, or be sent out to live out his days in a monastery. The surrender would come to mark the end of the major Saxon resistance to Francia, and were followed by 7 years of peace. Some revolts would continue to arise until 804, but they were sporadic and none of them were severe. During the final years of the 8th century, Charlemagne would come to adopt a more lenient stance towards Saxony, easing several of the special laws in the region, and by the early 9th century, Saxony had become an integrated part of the Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne's war with the Saxons would come to be the longest lasting conflict during his reign, spanning over 30 years. It demonstrated Charlemagne's determination to conquer the region and increase the power of Christendom, as well as his ruthlessness in the face of repeating dissent and opposition. Today I hope you learned something new about Charlemagne, and don't forget that if you liked this video and want to see more videos like it, hit the like, share and subscribe buttons.